You might have heard that video games can tell stories. If you're not a gamer, then you might roll your eyes at the idea, because video games are games, right? You shoot things like zombies. How can you tell a story that way? Well, you wouldn't be alone in that thought. This is a quote from David Cage, creator of games like Indigo Prophecy, Heavy Rain, and Detroit Become Human. In his eyes, storytelling in gaming is very hard because the game is limited to what the player can do on the controller. So how can you possibly tell a good enough story utilizing just small amount of action? Well, this seems to be the problem that most developers have. How can you tell this vast story and be limited to the buttons on the controller? One solution that many developers have is that you can tell your story in cutscenes and then let the player play some parts of the story. For example, in Grand Theft Auto 4, you play as an Eastern European named Niko Bellic, who is trying to escape his violent past and pursue the American dream. But the gameplay itself is limited to driving, walking, punching, and shooting. So the moments that you play in the story are the moments that utilize those things. You drive people to where they need to be.
Maybe you should drive.
Oh, maybe I should.
Okay.
You walk certain places, you punch certain people, and you shoot some people.
Our problems with your cousin.
I told you to stop.
And this is because there's no way for the player to completely control every single moment of Niko's life. And this happens in most games, to name a few: Zelda Breath of the Wild, BioShock, Call of Duty, Hellblade, games like that. These are all games that have very big stories, and the player can only play certain parts of it because, well, like David said, they don't have enough buttons. What this does is it creates a separated way of thinking about games. You think about the game part and the story part, as if they're two different parts that exist independently. But you don't think of other art forms that way. Think about Guernica. You know, would you look at Guernica and say, oh yeah, Picasso used some really good colors, but I don't really like his story? Like, that doesn't really make any sense. Game reviewers use this to review games. They actually split the game up into categories.
But the script often takes its grim, dark self too seriously. Outriders is at its best when you're blasting your way through hordes of bad guys with a couple of friends.
You don't see movies being rated that way or books being rated that way. And it's because games don't have a very cohesive way of telling their story. But there is a way to tell cohesive stories in video games, and you don't need a million buttons to do so. You just need to tell your story about what the player can do. In other words, build your story around the gameplay. This is Celeste. It was a game developed by Extremely OK Games and was released for PC in 2018. And it shows us exactly how cohesive storytelling can work in a video game. The rest of this video will spoil Celeste entirely, so if you're at all interested in the game, please play the game first, and then come watch this video. Otherwise, we're spoiling everything here, so that's your warning. 3, 2, 1. Let's look at how you begin the game in Grand Theft Auto 4. The first task that you're given is to drive Roman, Niko's cousin, over to his house. And once you get there, you watch a cutscene about how Roman was lying and bullshitting this whole time about how great life is and everything. After you watch that cutscene, then you find out he's gonna go gamble somewhere, so you drive him to the gambling place.
Nico, you're driving us to a hardware store on Dillon Street.
And then you sit there and wait outside to see if loan sharks come in.
Call me if some Albanians show up in some beige Willard.
And then you spot loan sharks, and so Roman comes back outside, and then you have to lose the loan sharks on the road before you continue the story. Each of these gameplay parts gives the player something to do in the story, but it does just feel like we're given something to do. They're chores, almost. They're assignments. It's because this is pieces of a bigger story. In Celeste, when you begin the game, it looks to be a platformer, and if you're familiar with platformers, then you already know what to do. You have to go forward by ascending, so that's what you do, and eventually you find yourself climbing Mount Celeste. It just so happens that the first thing that you learn about Madeline is that she feels like she has to scale the mountain. She doesn't know exactly why, she just feels like she has to do it. Instead of telling the player exactly what to do, there's not an explicit goal. Instead, it's implied through level design, which allows the player to feel like they're the ones making their own decision. Because the player isn't explicitly told what to do, the gameplay doesn't feel like an obligation. So now the goals of you and Madeline are the same, and you both care about the same thing. In Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, the motivation to keep you playing is one of curiosity. Because it's a really interesting game and there's so many interesting things happening, you keep playing to the next story point because you want to know what's going to happen to Senua. But Senua is there for a different reason entirely. She's not there out of curiosity. She is there to try to save the soul of her dead lover.
I'll find you, my love. I promise.
The gameplay puts you inside of Senua's mind sometimes.
Finish this. Finish this. Finish him.
But then takes you out other times.
Before she first met him, she was not in a good place.
What it does is it keeps your perspective quite different than Senua's, which constantly separates the game from the story. Celeste is a hard game. It's what's known as a precision platformer, meaning it takes a lot of very precise movements to get through all the challenges, and it takes a lot of tries to get through. And it just so happens that your motivation to get through these challenges are the same as Madeline's. You try to get through these challenges no matter how many times it takes you. And that's exactly what Madeline's trying to do. No matter what, she's going to scale this mountain. When Madeline approaches the mountain, there's a lot of people that say it's gonna be hard. Even she tells herself this is gonna be really hard, but she goes through it anyway. What's really interesting in this game is that there's no lives. There's actually a death counter. What it means is that it's tracking all the times that you fail at something, and the game even tells you to be proud of your failures because they're necessary for success. What it does is it shows the player how much work they're putting into the game, and it mirrors the amount of dedication that Madeline has to try to scale the mountain. The player's motivation is the same as the story's. In Call of Duty Modern Warfare, there are a ton of enemies that you have to shoot, and although it's really engaging to shoot all these enemies, it's not really meaningful in shooting each and every one. They're kind of stepping stones to get to the next story point of the game. The enemies act as objectives and typically aren't thematically relevant to the overall story. Sometimes they are, which is really cool, but most of the time...
All clear. Let's get the power up.
Most of the time they're not. In Celeste, you come to a point where you meet the antagonist, and when you meet them for the first time, they seem like pretty much any other video game antagonist. But this one is different. Inside the world of Celeste, the mountain itself has some sort of magical power that physically manifests the thoughts of the climbers. So what you're seeing is not just some enemy that's placed to try to stop Madeline from getting to the top, it's the personification of Madeline's anxiety. So now, when you're battling the antagonist, you're literally battling Madeline's anxiety. And it's really cool because it's both metaphorical and literal at the same time. After getting pretty deep into the game, you run into these weird looking monsters that you learn are a part of Madeline's thoughts. Facing these enemies has powerful implications. It gives so much context to our actions, and beating the antagonist means so much more than simply conquering an enemy. When you conquer the enemy, Madeline is literally conquering her inner demons. The enemies aren't treated simply as objectives, but are thematically tied to the story. There's this weird thing that happens in Zelda games. When you beat a Zelda game, evil is vanquished, peace returns. So that's great, but then the story ends and you leave the game. But you can go back to the game if you want to, kind of explore the world some more. But when you do that, the boss resets.
But basically it just makes you continue at the door of the final boss. There is nothing after it. It doesn't let you per se continue on, which I think is kind of lame. I was hoping the game would continue after I beat it and maybe Hyrule comes back to life or I can just go continue.
You get sent back right before you confront Ganon, and you get nothing for beating him. The world is exactly the same as it was. None of the characters acknowledge that you'd beaten him, and he's still there in the castle. why don't you get to explore the world after he's gone?
So it's as if you did nothing. And if you speak to almost any Zelda fan, they'll tell you that they wish that they could go back into the game and play while the whole thing was peaceful. It would feel as if they actually did something. So with the player lacking closure, what this goes to show is that they're connected to the world, and they feel like the gameplay isn't accurately represented by the story. If you could go back into the world and play while it was peaceful, that would be storytelling in gameplay. In Celeste, at the very end of the game, Madeline finally conquers her anxiety, but not in the way that you would think. She actually has to accept her anxiety and learn to work with her. Now, when we see Madeline accept her anxiety and work with her, it's not just something that we're told in the dialogue. Madeline's not sitting there thinking, okay, well, I guess I gotta accept it and move on. It's actually presented to us in gameplay form. The personification of her anxiety becomes a power-up for us. It's probably one of the coolest video game metaphors that I've seen. We're now able to do more things because of Madeline's acceptance. The gameplay is directly affected by the story. Celeste has an incredible story that not only deals with a heavy and important topic, depression, but it's also cohesive. It's a story that exists within the gameplay. The way the developer was able to do this was because of two things. One, because of just straight talent, because it's really good writing. And two, because there was a game that was already made that they could write for. Celeste was made by the same developer as a game jam game first. It was just a game where you scaled a mountain. But the story was written about the gameplay later on. It contextualized everything that you were doing. The gameplay never changed, but the story contextualized everything to make it have more meaning.
The way we went to the story was like, well, what is the player motive? Like, why is the player climbing this mountain? And then try to match that with the character's motivations. And it just sort of brought out all this mental health stuff that I guess had been just under the surface for me. And eventually we realized that the story was sort of the heartbeat of the game and restructured it so that it was the driving force for the player.
This is the kind of storytelling that's missing in games. You don't always need a button for every single action in the character's life. Just shrink the story from something that's huge to something that's about the gameplay. Make your story about those buttons. Hello, my name is Devon and this is Half Caff. If you enjoyed that, you can support me on Patreon. I have a link below the like button. You can also go to this link here at gamesover.coffee. That is a place that has every kind of link. I also do other shows on this show, Dev Brew. There's also a second channel that I have called Games Over More Coffee, that kind of more loose form where I'm talking about people who have submitted their games to me and I do like a game design breakdown about it. So look into that if you'd like. So thank you for watching. I'll drink my coffee. Cold, but not too cold. I have a coffee cup warmer, I don't know where it is. But they only let the player play bits of a much bigger story, and it's because, like David said, there's not enough buttons on the controller.